Williams, and I am one of the staff therapists here at the Refuge Center for Counseling. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and this is a second career for me. I actually retired from the Procter & Gamble company after 34 years there. I had an education in engineering and ended up spending most of my career in supply chain. So I'm very grateful to be at this stage of my life and being able to do this kind of work, because I realized that I missed out on a lot. And so I'm really glad to be here with you all today. And we're going to be talking about depression a little bit today. And it's good to talk about it. It's not something we like to sit around and think about all the time, but it's very important. It's a common problem. It affects men and women throughout the adult life cycle, and certainly affects children as well. And there's a lot going on in our world, and quite honestly, with everything that's happening today, we would say there's probably not a person on the planet who would not be experiencing some level of depression. We are all dealing with COVID. It has impacted all of us relationally, socially, financially, politically, and even spiritually. Some of us would wonder, where is God in this? And is there meaning and purpose in this in some way? It's a fair question. Other current cultural events also would cause us to slow down and be thoughtful about many things. This is a presidential election season, so we're dealing with politics. We're also dealing with just right now in our culture, social justice issues, racial inequality issues, protests, riots, and there's a lot for all of us to listen to think about, and to figure out how we fit into all of this. The other thing we need to mention, particularly for you from the standpoint of where you are in life, you're at a life stage where most of you have left your family. I imagine you've left your home for the first time maybe. And so you are sort of getting your feet under you. You're learning to make your own decisions. You have responsibility, and you have a lot of freedom. And you also have a lot of obligations, and it's a lot to deal with. But you're in a life stage of transition, and along the way, there can be a lot of unpleasant feelings and emotions. Loneliness, I've left my friends. You may have left a relationship that was very special to you. You may be wondering, do I really have what it takes to make it in the major that I've chosen? Or you may really just be homesick for your family. And you just may not have found your place yet in sort of the social structure of your new location. Whatever it may be, those are certainly good and big, important reasons where you might be feeling some depression. Some of you, sadly enough, have experienced trauma. And when I say trauma, what I'm talking about, trauma is either some form of abuse where something was done to you that you didn't want or need, or a type of neglect where something that you did need was withheld from you. So some of you, sadly, have experienced some form of trauma, and you find yourself coming away from that experience with a lot of very uncomfortable feelings, and especially thoughts about yourself and the world about you. And depression can certainly be a part of that. There's one other thing that we need to mention here as we think about this stage of life. Research shows, and this is some research that Lifeway did a few years ago, that has to do with young people, what happens to their faith or their belief in God when they leave home and go into college. And they found this from the research, essentially that roughly 70% of young people who self-described as being a Christian or having a strong spiritual faith in high school, 70% of them will leave that somewhere in their time in college. And of that 70%, only about 34% will return to it later. So if you do the math on that, it's about 1 in 4. And so if that's true, if it's true for you all, it means 1 in 4 of you may, somewhere along this journey, rethink your faith and step away from it and may never come back to it. It's a sobering statistic. It's not a pleasant statistic, but it's one we should think about. And we might ask ourselves why. And so as I talk about depression, this is potentially part of the why. What happens to us as we move through our spiritual lives? And just offer this thought. Many of us came to our faith, or we became Christians at a young age. About the same time we may have learned about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. And maybe our early experience with the Lord was one that was pretty simplistic. When we're little kids, the world is pretty dualistic. Things are either good or bad, they're right or wrong. It's a very black and white world for the most part. But as we get older, and this is what some of the research begin to expose, is that the grayness of the adult life caused young people to realize that they just had some troubling unanswered questions about their faith, and that their faith just was not working for them. Now, what does that mean? It means that perhaps that our spiritual maturity, or our faith, our growing of our faith, or however we might want to think about that, our growing understanding of God, somehow that may not have kept pace with our physical growth and our social growth. And that may not be your fault. It may simply be because you haven't had a chance or the opportunity to really explore your faith in deeper ways and deal with some of the more troubling questions, such as, I prayed and God didn't answer, or something bad happened and I thought if I was in the will of God, following Him, that wouldn't happen. These are legitimate questions, and they deserve an adult reflection and thought process. And so this is a difficult time. It's a fun time, it's a good time, but it's difficult, and there's a lot to navigate. So let's dive in here. Let me talk a little bit about depression, and then we'll come back and maybe just take a few minutes at the end to talk about what can we take from the Bible around this, perhaps. Real briefly, I'm just going to review a definition of depression here. Some of you will be somewhat familiar with this, some of you may not, but just to ground us, we'll just use a definition this way, that it's a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of isolation, disconnection, fear, and sadness. It often affects how we feel, how we think, how we act, and it may even include a loss of things that you previously enjoyed doing, things that were fun for you. You just I just don't feel like doing that anymore, or it's not fun anymore, stuff like that. That's called anhedonia, and it is a symptom of clinical depression. So you may have experienced some of that. Other symptoms include things like sleep problems, restlessness, feeling tired, a general lack of energy, feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness. Weight changes up or down can accompany depression, sluggishness, trouble concentrating, inappropriate feelings of guilt. Now, sometimes guilt's legitimate. If we do something wrong, we're going to naturally feel guilt about that. But sometimes we're feeling inappropriate guilt, and that's a common experience of people who have been through trauma, which they've not been able to resolve in a healthy way. Or maybe a lack of enjoyment and pleasure, as I mentioned before, in things that were previously enjoyable. But if you have the majority of these symptoms lasting for multiple weeks on most days, then you may, in fact, have what we might call clinical depression. Now, that sounds kind of ominous, but it's simply a way of saying you've got more than just normal depression. We all have good days and bad days, and we can experience some level of depression through the ups and downs of life. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're having these kind of symptoms frequently and on a sustained basis, then it's definitely going to be important for you to think about getting some help with that. And part of my objective here today is to just make sure we can all recognize depression. It's kind of like if we don't recognize we have pain, then we don't know we need help. Or like the lights on your dashboard of your car or truck. When the light comes on, it indicates there's something wrong under the hood. And in the same way, we just want to know when these symptoms pop up, that doesn't mean we're defective. It just means there's something we need to maybe take a closer look at. Let me talk a little bit now about how we typically respond to depression, okay? Often we just try to beat ourselves up. We try to tell ourselves things like, I'm defective, I shouldn't be feeling this way, and especially everyone else seems to be doing fine in our social media world. Of course, that's not true. We know that's not true, but nonetheless, constant exposure to that will cause us to believe otherwise. But we conclude something is wrong with me. And Secondly, we may just try to ignore it or just reject the idea altogether and hope it goes away, just denial. A third response would commonly be we may tell the wrong people who end up shaming us. This is particularly problematic. If you've ever had someone try to tell you why you shouldn't be feeling a certain way, you know how that feels. For you fours on the Enneagram out there, many of us are behind you in connection to our emotions and embracing our emotions. But sometimes if we share our emotions or a feeling of depression with the wrong person, an unsafe person, and they may well intended, but they end up telling us or giving us overly simplistic answers, then that's not going to be helpful, and it's going to probably cause you to be a little angry with them, and it may cause you to doubt yourself again. So those are common responses, and of course we do the best we can, but sometimes the discomfort and pain of depression will lead us into medicating in whatever way we need to comfort ourselves. And of course that includes things, or can include things like alcohol, drugs, tobacco, food, work, exercise, sex, and certainly social media. Yes, in fact, our phone can be a barrier to our recovery or our healing from depression, because every time we pick up the phone and someone has said something positive about us or to us, or someone has liked something that we've posted, we get a hit of dopamine, which is the feel-good hormone, and that's why we do it. So we cope the best we can, and there's some really good information in this book called How to Be Human in a Digital World that speaks a lot to our relationship with social media. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about depression from the standpoint of, well, what causes it then? It is a real or perceived loss of relationships, control, stability, familiarity, dreams, hope or hopes, acceptance from others, etc. So these life experiences that we may experience as we move through different stages of our life, or circumstances outside of our control, or even hormonal changes during the adult life cycle, all of these things can cause us to experience this feeling of being depressed. Also, irrational, incorrect, unfair, or negative beliefs about ourselves, others, or God, which may have originated from others, and certainly including social media, all of these things can contribute and cause feelings of depression in us. Now let's talk about what to do about it for just a few minutes. First of all, we're going to say if you're feeling depressed, tell someone who is safe. Tell a close friend who can help you, or you may want to consider going to a counselor if you feel like you've been in deep depression for a while, and share what is happening. Consult with your doctor or primary care physician if that's appropriate, and just make sure you get someone to care with, to walk along this journey with you, to care for you, because there's a lot to unpack when it comes to depression. Sharing unpleasant emotions with healthy, safe people has been proven to cause the emotion to resolve. In fact, not sharing an unpleasant emotion with people not only doesn't allow it to resolve, but it actually makes it worse. So God has given us emotions. The limbic part of our brain houses our emotions, and the best thing we can do for them, and again, we can thank our fours for this on the Enneagram, but the importance of name our emotions to tame them. You might say name it to tame it, but the ability to say what's going on to another safe person who's not going to give you platitudes and simplistic answers can be so helpful to helping you move forward and heal. Let's talk for a minute about a biblical perspective. You know, depression is not new. The Bible is full of very righteous people who were depressed. And I'm going to run through just a few of them here. David, many of you are familiar with David, his fear of Saul, his despair from his sin following his sexual adultery with Bathsheba, depression from the loss of his first child, and then depression from also the death of his sons later in his life. Elijah, right after his big victory over the priests of Baal, you may know the story, he fell into deep despair and depression because of his fear of, I'm blanking on her name now, but Jezebel, sorry. Jonah was angry at God because He made him go to Nineveh, and then God was going to show grace to the people of Nineveh, and Jonah didn't want that. Job, of course, might be our poster boy for depression. And in fact, chapter 30, verses 15 through 17 provides a very good description of depression. You might want to check that out. Moses also experienced depression. He was grieved over the sin of his people in Exodus 32. Jeremiah was also known as the weeping prophet because of the rejection by the people he loved. He was alone, poor, and ridiculed. You can find that in Jeremiah chapter 20. And then Jesus, of course, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, Isaiah says. In the garden, we know Jesus was conflicted and feeling deep despair and struggling and sadness, certainly in the garden, and then earlier in his life with the passing of his close friend Lazarus. Well, what do we learn from these accounts? Here's the thing. In all of these, the Lord was and is close by each of us, always seeking connection with us during these times of storms and crazy circumstances in our life. One of my favorite verses is Psalm 34, and it's verses 18 and 19. It says this: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. A righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers them from them all." He has experienced and knows everything we feel, and he is with us even right now. He is a redeemer and a restorer, and nothing is wasted with him. So I hope that you'll take some encouragement from this, and do remember that that depression is a natural part of living, and grief and loss is a natural part of life. And in fact, some of you are familiar with Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And there's a 6th stage out now, and it's kind of pioneered and has been researched by a guy named David Kessler. He's got a book out called Finding Meaning, and that's he's advancing the idea that in fact there is a 6th stage of grief in the grief process, and that is finding meaning in the loss.